There's been a lot of talk this season about the OKC Thunder being good, but they're just a trade or a move away from being really good. I mean, contender level good. And any national media or podcast that covers the NBA has talked about this probably in the last few weeks after the OKC Thunder beat the Boston Celtics, the Denver Nuggets, and the Timberwolves. But as a Thunder fan myself, of course I'm going to think that the Thunder are good. But as an objective observer, I feel pretty much the same because they are good. However, are they good isn't the exact question we should ask when looking at this team. It's how good are they, and how good should we expect them to be in the future? I think this whole OKC success can be linked to a couple of quotes, and I'll reiterate one later. But the first one I want to talk about is assistant GM to the Thunder between 2008 and 2020, Troy Weaver, saying, "My philosophy is we don't draft players, we draft people. Get the person right. More times than not, high picks that don't pan out, you miss on the person. Get the person right and the basketball takes care of itself. Someone that is committed to working, a fierce competitor, and that the community can be proud of on and off the floor." So let's address a couple of elephants in the room, some concerns the Thunder fan base may have before we get too far into this. And one of them obviously is going to be the rebounding. It's a big persistent issue that the Thunder have been dealing with throughout the season. Currently, I believe 29th in the league in rebounding, so they're one of the worst, but they're still second in the West, so they've been able to overcome that. However, with the last two losses to the Atlanta Hawks and the Brooklyn Nets, two teams they've already beat this year, the trade section of the fans has been getting louder. That we need to make a move to capitalize on how good we are, to fix this rebounding issue, and regardless which side of the trade tree you fall on, realistically, either way I think you're fine. The Thunder currently, even with the rebounding issues, have been doing well and are probably just coming off a really intense Brooklyn Nets or Boston Celtics game. And then if you do make a trade, your rebounding's probably going to get better, but what's going to fall into decline? So who knows? But realistically, those are the biggest concerns that play into the larger concern of, is this team going to be capable of handling themselves in a playoff series? If you have a really intense Boston game like that, you can't afford in the next game to come out and have dead legs. So the inexperience of the postseason may be a bigger thing than people make it out to, and we'll talk about it more in a moment. But these are kind of the headline concerns the Thunder fans have at the moment. So if you're not a Thunder fan and your team's going against the Thunder, those are the things to look for. So let's get to the short and sweet of it before we dive into the details. The Thunder are as good as they are because they have a versatile offense and a reliable defense, both being in the top 10 in the league, and I think currently both in the top 5. It's not unusual for every guy that steps on the floor for the Thunder, which notably is quite a few, to score at least once, but typically hold a pretty good number of points on the score sheet. And they like to dip into that bench quite a bit. So let's get a quick pro and con list out of the way before we get too far. The Thunder have a lot of good players that work hard on both ends of the floor, but they're the second youngest team in the NBA. And not having experience could be what edges you out of the finals. They're skilled, but potentially lacking that necessary experience, especially in the postseason. While they're a little more concrete on certain rotations this year, Mark Daigneault, the head coach, does like to experiment, which sometimes can come off as feeling like the coaching staff isn't taking a game seriously. By extension, there's a handful of talented guys on the roster that also don't see very many minutes. So, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but you'd like to see some of those guys get some minutes. That's kind of why they're in the NBA. Now, what does the Thunder have specifically that has everyone from Thunder-specific podcasts and content creators and fans all the way up to top-level national coverage, NBA, ESPN, everybody who covers basketball, talking about them in the NBA Finals contenders list? As a collective, they're all about making the extra pass, playing unselfish basketball, and doing a lot of work off the ball. Lots of drive and kicking, a lot of good passers, and, well, you kind of need space to do all of that, so they have three-point shooters and finishing capabilities at the rim. But we have to start with probably the most notable name, or at least the one you've probably heard of before, with the first team All-NBA MVP vote-getting Shay Gilgeous-Alexander, the man that runs the show and usually walks away with usually a quiet 30 points, if not more. Not only can the man score, he's currently leading the NBA in steals and is near All-NBA defense levels of defense. Now, of course, you can contribute to some of that defensive skill playing alongside the master of the torture chamber himself, Dort, one of the hardest defenders in the league. Lou is wildly underrated as a defensive player who can lock down some of the NBA's best. Now on to the young starters that people who play 2K may be a little bit more familiar with Josh Giddey, Jalen Willaim, and Chet Holmgren. Well, Josh Giddey had a slow start. He has been getting hot from three recently, which is kind of weird because he's not known as a three-point shooter. It still makes a big impact on the game, just kind of out of nowhere. The three certainly help, but the thing that makes Josh Giddey special and why the Thunder value him significantly is his vision, his basketball IQ, and his ability to make passes that a lot of people can't, to make him a playmaker at heart. This guy is getting back into what made him good last year, and it's not shooting threes, it's making passes. It's being the slob wizard, if you will, the sideline out of bound passer that has done some pretty crazy things. Then we have Jalen J-Dub Williams, and the dude's just good. For a sophomore player, he's out there every time they play, playing against some of the hardest guys to guard in the league. So not only is he defensively capable of guarding effectively 1 through 4, maybe 5 depending on, but he's also a bucket. Then we round out the starters with a 7-footer himself, Chet Holmgren. Not only is the dude over 7 feet tall, but he's got a solid 3-shot, handles that no 7-footer should have, and a bag of skills to finish when he gets to the rim. Needless to say, he's a hell of a rim protector at that 7'1" to 7'4" height stature, because we don't really know exactly, but it's somewhere in that range. And sure, he's not the thickest guy out there, looking a little lanky, but he's gone up against some of the biggest, toughest bigs in the league and been able to handle himself. So just a quick recap of the starters. We've got an All-NBA first-team guard, a world-class defender who usually gets time on the opposing player's best player, or opposing team's best player. A young playmaker who's hitting threes out of nowhere, another guy that's a walking bucket and solid defender, and runs a second unit pretty well. And then, of course, the 7-footer with handles. We're starting off pretty good. Well, OKC starters are impressive. The bench has been a massive help to them in being so competitive this year in the Western Conference. Usually it's the 6th man coming off the bench. You either have rookie Cason Wallace, another strong defending guard who plays much bigger than he is, or Isaiah Joe, who prior to the season was a stellar 3-point shooter and a spark plug off the bench, but has rounded out his game in pretty much every way. These two, along with Aaron Wiggins, no relation to Andrew Wiggins, but he did save basketball, Kendrick Williams, the backup big and hype man of the team, and then we have Jalen Williams from Arkansas being the other backup big man. Kenny Hustle and Jay Will also feel like the heart of the team collectively, That's just entirely vibes-based analysis, but it feels right. Also, this clip of J. Will and Trey Mann is just what I live for. Now, speaking of that, we've also seen some time from Trey Mann, pseudo-rookie Vasilije Micic, Ousmane Dieng, another French bigman, Davis Bertans, the Latvian laser, Lindy Waters III, the homegrown guy, and Olivier Sarr. We've also seen very, very limited minutes from Alexei Pokusevski and Keontae Johnson. Now on to the coaching staff led by Mark Daigneault, a guy that's risen through the Thunder organization starting with the Blue, the Thunder G League affiliate, back in 2014. Mark would finish second in Coach of the Year voting last year in the 2022-2023 season after the Thunder went 40-42, exceeding expectations all around. One of my personal favorite little quips of his from a post-game recently was separating players into artists or scientists. And that sounds kind of weird and doesn't make a lot of sense on the surface level, but being able to see the nuance of how players approach the technique versus the understanding or the larger strategic view of the game and how they metabolize that is really interesting. Sure, part of a coach's job is to make adjustments and understand his players, but Mark has notably been a little experimental with some of the lineups he has played. Not only is Mark good with the processing of the game and how it's played and his relationship to his team, but he's also out there making like the third best, most successful challenges out there. Like, he trusts his team, he trusts his bench, he trusts his assistant coaches. He's like the third most successful challenging coach with like a 70% or just above 70% success rate in the NBA. It's pretty wild. Like, it's just a weird thing to get this in depth on a coach, because a lot of times it doesn't feel like the coach at least directly impacts the game, but I think Mark is one of the few that in the course of the game you can kind of feel his influence. Now on to the front office helmed by one Sam Presti, the man behind the short but impressive legacy the Thunder have had since 2008. A GM does a lot more, obviously, than just facilitate deals and make draft picks, which, of course, he's not even doing that alone. But much like Mark, hearing him talk about the approach to running an organization, getting players, is fascinating. There's not a lot of GMs in the league I would listen to for over an hour, and most of them don't even have a lot of media availability anyway, but Sam Presti's definitely one of those guys. Sam once said, "Anytime we draft a player, we're not drafting him for where he is today. We're also drafting a player because we feel like we want to walk hand in hand with them through their development." So let's just look at a few of these players the Thunder has approached over the years. So the team moves from Seattle to OKC back in 2008, and the year previously, they had drafted Kevin Durant. Sam Presti was part of that as well. But 2008, the first season in OKC, Kevin Durant's a sophomore. Who do they draft but none other than Russell Westbrook? Blech. Now the season doesn't go great, but Russ did get named to the NBA's all-rookie first team. 2009 would only get better as they would draft James Harden, and the team, within that 4-year span, would make it to the NBA Finals in 2012. So let's look at what they've done in 4 years. Sam Presti's front office has led to getting technically KD, which I know was the Sonics, but regardless, drafted Russ and Harden, and got to the finals. That's not a bad first 4 years. Of course, Harden leaving wasn't ideal, but the Thunder would make the Western Conference Finals in 13-14 and 15-16. We'd see some shaking up, of course, when KD would leave, and the Thunder would eventually trade Victor Oladipo and Domantas Sabonis in July of 2017 for Paul George, and later in September would make a trade for Carmelo Anthony. The team doing this, the front office doing this, would eventually lead us into the Thunder 2.0 era we're in today, when they'd eventually trade Paul George to the Clippers for a young SGA and acquiring Chris Paul from the Rockets. The SGA trade would help fill the Thunder's war chest of future picks, reaching 15 first-rounders and 22 second-rounders over the next 7 years. In 2021, The Thunder would draft Josh Giddey, Alperen Sengun, and Trey Mann, and eventually they would trade Sengun for 2 future picks, unfortunately. In 2022, the Thunder would knock it out of the park yet again, drafting Chet Holmgren, Jalen Williams, and Ousmane Dieng. The whole organization preaches patience, which most NBA fans unfortunately seem to hate. If there is an option to win now, why not do it regardless of the cost, seems to be the general consensus. The Thunder don't really like that, though. That's not how they think. Internal development and patience has generally been the approach, which largely seems to have worked quite well. You also see this from teams like the Magic and the Rockets, who are both young teams on the come-up, who are looking at developing some of that internal talent, one of them in the Rockets being Alperen Sengun. Team and organization coherence is important, and that is something that this whole drafting a person, not a player approach seems to work with. This brings me to the topic I may end up having to make a totally separate video on at some point, but I see a shift in the NBA of how teams are starting to approach roster construction, especially in smaller markets. They're looking at drafting players as like the significant avenue of success overall instead of making trades. They're being patient with development. So now that we have some background on the organization as a whole, their personnel, their philosophy, are they good? 100%. Not even just as a Thunder fan myself speaking. You just look at this team, the way they play, what their stats end up looking like at the end of a night, and how they're ranked, and yeah, they feel like they belong in that top echelon of the West. Now, whether or not they hold on to second for the rest of the season is kind of up in the air, but for sure this is a team that should be in the playoffs by the time the postseason rolls around, and whether or not they make it to the finals, it's going to be an educational postseason for them. Lacking that playoff experience is something that even if they get knocked in the first round, you can walk away feeling good. That next year we will be better. The Thunder will most likely make it into a further run into the playoffs than they did this season. Which ties into how good are they going to be in the future? People in the Thunder sphere have talked about the next dynasty, the next big three. And, well, I think that maybe that's a little overblown. This is a team we're going to be talking about in the postseason for the next 5 to 10 years easy. So if you are a Thunder fan, then thanks for sticking with me through all of this. If you're not a Thunder fan, I hope I have given you some information to walk away with and feel like you know the Thunder at least a little bit better. Because at the end of the day, this team is good because of the people. If you have the right people in place, the basketball will work itself out.